Well, thank you so much, Eric. It's really good to see you again. Certainly appreciate just all the work that you do, all the work that's going on at Stevens Point, and I just wish we were doing this in person. Fingers crossed, the next meeting will be in person. We got the vaccine out there, and I am just looking forward to it. Looking forward to the moment where I can join these sort of events without having to sit down here in my living room. But again, I'm Mandela Barnes, probably serving as Lieutenant Governor. And again, UW Stevens Point's Extension Lakes for, I just truly appreciate you putting on this event, the 2021 Water Week Conference. Something that's important to me is it's also important to the administration. As Governor Evers' first year in office, he declared it the year of clean drinking water. And the gathering is so important, again, because clean water and the health of our water systems throughout the state are paramount to our health as individuals and our health as communities, our quality of life, and the overall success of our state. And I just want to take a second to talk about our climate change task force, because any chance I get to talk about the climate change task force, I want to take advantage of it. And when Governor Evers and I took the stage on election night, the first thing I ever said is that we're going to bring science back to this state. And that's exactly what we've worked to do. And that started by joining the U.S. Climate Alliance. We set new energy goals for our state. And we wanted to be sure that we did everything we could do to make a difference, because for too long, Wisconsin lagged behind our regional partners and national partners in many instances. We created the Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy, and we created the task force, as I mentioned, on climate change. And I'm so proud to have led that work, but I'm so proud to have been joined by 30 something amazing individuals from across different sectors who were ready to take on the challenges of the day and quite possibly the greatest challenge of our lifetime. I would say generation, but I don't feel that that gives the crisis the attention that it deserves. And we want to be sure to have a diverse coalition, knowing that the only way we solve our problems is we bring more people to the table, more voices of impacted residents, more voices of people who've been left out of the conversation traditionally. And after a year or so of listening to experts and also listening to the public, we came together we came together and released a set of about 55 recommendations that span 9 different sectors. And many of these provisions are included in the state budget, but that's not what you're here to hear today. We are here to hear from Professor Hayhoe. I am incredibly excited to have an opportunity to introduce her. Her work speaks for itself. I know you all are very familiar with what she's been doing and been able to do, and the recognition that she's received. It is amazing to be in the same virtual space as her right now, as I talk about a passion of mine, which is also a passion of hers. And it is an obligation for the state to act. It is an obligation for this nation to act. And with that obligation, with national leadership, we can finally see global change in the right direction, in a positive direction. Because as long as the United States fails to be a leader, other nations across the world, across the planet, will find no reason to meet obligations that would make this world a more habitable place. And as we talk more and more about space exploration and traveling to Mars, and I saw in the news a couple of weeks ago, or if not last week, where somebody's planning to build a space hotel. But it's important for us to pay attention to the problems we have here now. We have to demonstrate widespread support for an agenda in order to get our legislature here in Wisconsin to keep these investments in the budget, just like we have to demonstrate widespread support for a national agenda that gets us to where we need to be. That's why we work so hard to build a coalition in state to sort of serve as an example of what could be across the country. This is essential to make climate action a reality, not just in Wisconsin, but all over the country and across the world. We have to be able to talk to people who don't always agree with us. And we have to be able to come together around this existential threat, because floods and disasters do not care about your partisan affiliation. And this is something that the next speaker has spent her entire career mastering, which is why I'm so excited about it. Professor Katharine Hayhoe is an accomplished atmospheric scientist who serves as professor of public policy and public law at Texas Tech University. And she also co-directs their Climate Center, which just sounds like an amazing operation, especially in a state like Texas that demonstrated so much to us in the past couple weeks, but also the past several decades, generations, as they've been known as the oil capital of America. But the need to transition us away from fossil fuels, Texas is an incredible place for us to demonstrate that this can work. And just last week, it was announced that she's joining the Nature Conservancy as its next chief scientist. She will be the first woman in this position. But not only is she an accomplished academic and climate leader, she's also a remarkable communicator, one who spent years conveying climate science information to diverse audiences, including people whose politics make them less likely to embrace the concept of climate change. And this is something that we can all learn from, especially myself, and it's something we desperately need more in order for us to save our politics, to save our people, and to save this planet. So with that said, let's all give a warm welcome to Professor Katharine Hayhoe. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to visit you virtually, as well as I often do in person with so many good colleagues at the university there in Madison. And today, as we're talking about water, I want to connect that to climate and talk about how we can all have conversations about climate together. We're going to be taking questions at the end. We're going to be doing that through the event Mobi page, which we've already been using for previous sessions if you've been there, and you'll be using it the rest of this week. So if you have questions as we go along, you can put them in event Mobi at any time. And the fun part is that you get to upvote questions that you most want me to get to, because we might not have time to get to all your questions. So feel free to put questions there as we go along and see what questions other people are posting as well. Let me share my screen with you and we will get started. So talking about climate. First of all, I want to start with what the landscape looks like. And I mean landscape both figuratively and literally. When you ask people across the entire United States, do you think global warming is happening? You see that almost every county, this is public opinion by county, almost every county in the whole country is orange, which means that more than 50% of people would say yes. Where I live in Texas, most counties are orange. Where you live in Wisconsin, most counties are orange. You can spot Dane County right there in the middle. It's a little bit darker orange because you have so many scientists at the university saying that, yes, it is happening. And you see it happening in front of your very eyes with the ice season on Lake Medonta, with the cross-country ski season, with things changing very quickly, so quickly that we can't help but notice them. So most people agree that global warming is happening. And then they ask people, do you think that it will harm plants and animals? And most people say, yes, I think it will harm plants and animals. Do you think it will harm people in the future? So not now, but in the future. And the answer is pretty much exactly the same. People say yes. So the majority of people, 70% or more of people, are on board with the idea that global warming is real and it will harm plants and animals and it will harm future generations. Then we ask, will it harm people in developing countries? So people not here, but over there. And the colors get a little bit lighter. You start to see a little bit more blue coming in. Even Dane County is a little bit lighter orange than it used to be. And then they ask, will it harm people in the United States? All of a sudden, we've dropped more than 10% from the number of people who think it's real. They don't think it's going to harm people in the US. We start to see some blue counties, even in Illinois. There's one in northern Wisconsin, quite a few in Indiana. And then they asked this question. They said, do you think it will affect you? All of a sudden, it's blue across almost the whole map. In fact, look at Wisconsin. There's not a single orange county in Wisconsin, not even this one. There are a few orange counties in Chicago, Miami, Houston, southern Texas, and New Mexico, and as well as California and Arizona. And you might say, well, who lives in those counties? Are there more scientists there than in Dane County? No. It turns out the most concerned people group in the whole United States is Hispanic Catholics. And you might say, well, of course, that's because the Pope wrote an encyclical more than 5 years ago now talking all about climate change. Well, no, actually, the least concerned people in the whole United States are white Catholics. They actually beat out white evangelical Protestants by 1 percentage point. But that's a different talk where we get into the nexus between religion and politics in the United States. I just bring that up now so that you know what's going on. But focus on Wisconsin, focus on Minnesota, Minneapolis, focus on Iowa and Illinois. You can see we have a long way to go because only 43% of people think that it will affect us personally. And this 30% gap is the gap that explains the lack of climate action. Because if you have a majority of people who agree that it's real, but a lot of those people don't think it matters to them, why would we do anything about it? We have a lot bigger priorities, so people think. That's why this gap is so important. We often think of the 30% gap between people who say it's happening and people who say it isn't. We often think of that 30% gap as the most important. We have to get everybody to agree it's happening. I would argue that the 30% gap that's more important is the one between the people who say it's happening and the people who don't think it matters. Because again, we could say that it's real, we could agree with all the science, but if we don't think it matters to us, why would we ever do anything to fix it? That's why this 30% gap is so important. So when we see this gap, we often think, all right, well, what can we do about it? And often as educators and as scientists and as people who are concerned and people who work with information and data, which there's plenty of when it comes to water, we often think, well, clearly more information is needed. And when we look to the information, we say, well, if people just understood the science, then they would understand how it affects us. And this is actually one of our most popular global weirding episodes called If I Just Tell Them the Facts, Surely They'll Change Their Minds, right? The answer to that is no, and I will explain why here. But speaking of the facts, we have a lot of facts. If you go to Google Scholar, where scientific studies are archived, there are 2.6 million studies on climate change in Google Scholar. That's a lot. We have 6 IPCC assessments. The sixth assessment is going to be released next year. We have 4 national climate assessments. The first one was published in 2000. Then I served as a lead author on the second one, the third one, and the fourth one, which came out 2 years ago. It was so big, it got split into 2 pieces. Volume 1 was 500 pages. Volume 2 was 1,600 pages. We have more than enough facts. And I give you these as great resources because they have a chapter on every region of the US, including one in the Midwest. There's a chapter on every sector, including water. So if you're interested, take a quick screenshot or go ahead and write down this web address because the water chapter and the Midwest chapter are well worth reading. But the point is we have a lot of information. And not only do we have that information, but that information has been clearly communicated by scientists for a very long time. For example, a year ago, 11,000 scientists signed this letter, a world scientist warning of a climate emergency. And we've been studying this for so long that these are literally the people who made the fundamental scientific discoveries that yes, climate is changing, yes, humans are responsible, and yes, digging up and burning coal at that time, and then later oil and natural gas, is what is responsible for the majority of this change. Through burning it, we generate heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. It being International Women's Day, I am really delighted to highlight the fact that we have Mrs. Eunice Foote in the middle here. We do not yet have a photo for her. If you Google it on the internet, Google will give you a photo. But that photo is not a verified photo. So I'm just using this nice little cartoon from a short movie they did about her because she was an amateur scientist who did experiments literally in the lab she had in her backyard that showed that if carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were higher, the planet would be warmer. And she published her work in 1856. Isn't that incredible? And then Fourier was the one who discovered that we have this natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keeps the planet at the perfect temperature for life, over 60 degrees Fahrenheit than it should be otherwise. John Tyndall designed and built some very advanced scientific instruments so he could measure specifically the infrared vibrational and rotational bands of carbon dioxide that absorb and release the heat. Svante Arrhenius was a Swedish chemist who, in between winning the Nobel Prize for his work in chemistry, he calculated by hand, it took him 2 years, by hand, the first climate model, showing how each different latitude band of the world would warm and how the Arctic would warm faster than the rest of the world if we increase carbon dioxide levels by 50%, 100%, 200% or more. And Guy Callender was the first person to collect 50 years of temperature data and show that yes, indeed, the planet was warming because of human emissions of heat-trapping gases. This is how long we have known all of this. It's absolutely incredible. So we have the science. It goes back very far. And yet, here we are. What is this? This is a figure from last February, just before COVID hit. I know that sort of feels like about 10 years ago right now, but it was just over a year ago. Just over a year ago before COVID hit. This is the list of the most politically polarized issues in the entire United States. The wider the gray bar, the more separated the average Republican and the average Democrat is from each other on a specific issue. And in this figure, the gray bars are ranked by their width. So the ones that are closer to the top are the more contentious, and the ones that are closer to the bottom are the less contentious ones. We have climate change and we have environmental protection right up at the top. Well, so then COVID hit. How did this change? I have a figure for that. This figure is from August. Now here, it's not ranked by the width of the gray bar. So I'm going to point out the 3 widest gray bars for you. That in number 3 place, we have what? The COVID outbreak. Yes, it rapidly became politically polarized as well. In place number 2, well, we have race and ethnic inequality. Of course, that became politically polarized. And in number 1, we have climate change still. So all of these issues which you might think should have no political polarization at all. I mean, a virus, really? Decades of racial inequity? How is that controversial or challengeable? And what a thermometer gives you, how could that be politically polarized? Yet these are the top polarized issues in the US today. And like I said, COVID was just a test tube example of how a virus became politicized so quickly that today the number 1 predictor of whether someone is willing to get a vaccine or not is simply where they fall on the political spectrum. And this is one of my sort of favorite cartoons. I can't really say it's favorite because it's sad, but it's also very true, that came out this past year. You've got COVID doctors saying, as long as we just provide the facts to the American people. And then over here, you've got climate scientists laughing and probably crying at the same time, saying, yeah, we tried that for 100 years and look how that's turned out. So at this point, we have a bigger question mark. People don't think climate change matters, and it's the most politically polarized issue in the entire country. What are we supposed to do? How to talk about it begins by understanding why. Why do people not think it matters, and why is it so politically polarized? So to understand why, we don't go to the physical scientists, we don't go to the atmospheric scientists or the climate scientists or the hydrologists or the engineers. To understand why, we have to go to people who study the human brain. We have to go to people like neuroscientist Tali Sharot and social scientist Dan Kahan, that I'll get to next. And when we go to the people who study the human brain and study human behavior, we start to get some information that really puts the pieces together. So here's what Tali Sharot says in her excellent TED Talk. She says, and in a really good book she wrote too called The Influential Mind, she says, our brains are programmed to get a kick out of information. But when we give people new information, they typically only accept it if they already believe it. If it contradicts what they believe, their brain shuts off. So giving people more information about climate change if they don't agree with it is not what's going to make a difference. And in fact, Dan Kahan from Yale University, he went on to actually study specifically if scientific literacy helped. And what he found is that people who had the highest degree of scientific literacy, they were not most concerned about climate change. They were most polarized. He went on to develop a measure he called ordinary science intelligence, which is a measure of people's ability to understand statistics and data and numbers. And when he asked people, is the planet warming due to human emissions of heat trapping gases? And he looked at the probability of a correct response. He found a positive but a weak correlation with people's ability to understand science, statistics, and data. Then he took that group and he divided it in half based on what? Based on political affiliation. And this is what he found. He found that more education, more intelligence actually decreased conservatives' ability to agree with the science. Why? Because the smarter we are, the better we are at what psychologists call motivated reasoning. In other words, when our identity is on the line, and you just saw climate change is the most politically polarized issue in the whole country, and it's been that way since the time of Obama, possibly even before. When our identity is on the line, we use our considerable smarts not to figure out if we're wrong, but to show why we're right. So the smarter we are, the better we are at arguing and showing and proving why we're right. So to go back to the neuroscience, Tali Sharot says, the wealth of information available today on the internet, because anybody can Google anything and find pretty much anything today, it makes us more resistant to change because it's so easy to find data that supports what we already believe. And again, the smarter we are, the better we are at finding it. Even worse, she says, as we are exposed to contradicting information and opinions, polarization expands over time as people receive more and more information. And so when I read this, I felt like, oh my goodness, what are we doing? Dumping more information on people actually increases polarization? We are screwed. Because here's what happens. So climate changes, and let me just put a star on that. We're not screwed. There is a way around this, okay? But we have to understand how the way we normally do things is counter-effective. So climate changes, and we get worried if we know anything about what's happening. We are very worried. As a scientist, I have a lot to keep me up at night. If I'm up at 2 a.m, I have all kinds of things to worry about, like methane leaking out of permafrost in the Arctic, or what's happening to the Gulf Coast, or the fact that climate change is supersizing our extreme events even faster than we thought. So the more we know, the more worried we are. But then here's the thing. Here's what we normally tend to do. Normally, what we tend to do is we say, well, if people aren't worried about it, if they don't think it matters, we need to share more scary information with them. We need more pictures of polar bears starving. We need more statistics about giant icebergs falling off Greenland and Antarctica. We need more information about how bad it's going to get, because it's going to get really bad. But what neuroscience and psychology tells us is that that leads most people, not all, most people to reject it even more if we don't know what to do about it. This is the key thing. If we know what to do with scary information, then it does motivate us. If there's a bear running at us and we know that we have to run faster than the person beside us, I'm Canadian, that's what they teach there. I don't know what they teach in Wisconsin. But if we know what we have to do, we will do it, right? But if we don't know what to do, and with climate change being such a huge issue and people telling you it's an existential threat to civilization as we know it, oh, go change your light bulb and eat less meat. We know that, instinctively, existential threat to civilization, changing our light bulb, recycling, and eating less or no meat. We know that those two things don't exactly go together. So we feel like, well, what am I supposed to do that actually will fix this problem anyways? And if we don't think there's anything we can do that makes a difference, and that's very important, we don't feel that sense that we can make a difference, then our defense mechanism kicks in, and it causes us instinctively to reject it even more, to just pull the covers up over our head. Inaction results, and climate changes more. Fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. And I would add, if we don't know what to do about it. If we don't know what to do, more scary information just paralyzes us even further. So how do we break this vicious cycle? We break it by sharing the right kind of information. And I want to do a little bit of a dig into that right now, starting with what we scientists normally share, but then showing how we can connect that information directly to what everybody cares about, because climate change really is an everything issue. The real problems we have are not lack of education, lack of intelligence, getting everybody on the same page with education. Though, don't get me wrong, I am an educator and education definitely helps. And in fact, educating kids can help change their parents' opinions. But it isn't just a matter of making sure everybody knows the science. We don't think it matters to us. There's a 30% gap between the people who say, I agree with the science, and the people who say it matters. 30% gap. And that gap is the problem. We don't think it matters to us, and we don't think there's anything positive and constructive that we can do to fix it. If our name is not Elon Musk or Bill Gates or the president of the United States, we feel like there's nothing we can do personally that would really make a difference. And so I ended at this map previously. I said, here's a map of people who don't think that global warming will harm them personally. You can see how it's dark blue across most of the country. But there's actually one more map I didn't show you. And this map is darker blue. But ironically, this map actually starts to show us the way out. What is this next map? This next map asks people a different question. It says, do you ever... Oh, I'm sorry. We don't think it matters because often we think it's a polar bear issue, an Arctic issue. If we see pictures of people, people are from far away. They're not here where we live. So when we say, do you think it will harm you personally? People say no. And then they ask one more question. Do you ever talk about it? Look at this. It is dark blue almost everywhere. Even in Madison, it's sort of a lightish blue, but it's still blue. What does this mean? It means if we don't talk about something, why would we care? Why would you care if you never talk about it? And if you don't talk about it, why would you ever support action or want to take action yourself? In fact, a brand new study just came out yesterday. I just saw it on Twitter yesterday. Twitter is where I see most of the scientific studies these days. I know, kind of horrifying, but that's where they go. A new study showed that the number one predictor of whether people are willing to vote to support climate action is whether they have conversations about it. Because our conversations reflect what we're thinking about. They reflect what we care about. And if we're never talking about climate change, why would anyone care, right? So this is the beginning of the way out. Because talking about something is something that every single one of us can do, right? We can all talk. We can use our voices literally. We can use our voices figuratively on social media. We can use our voices to talk to our families. We can talk to our place of work, our place of worship, our school, our university. If we're involved in a community organization, we're part of a ski club or the Rotary Club, our neighbors, our community. Every single one of us has a voice that we can use. And it turns out that I am absolutely convinced now, from a very deep dive into the social science plus 10 years of experience in doing this, that the single most important thing any individual can do is to use their voice to talk. About what? About why it matters and what we can do to fix it, because those are the two things that we're not talking about. We're talking about polar bears. We're talking about ice sheets. We're talking about how we have a certain number of years to miraculously save the planet or we're all going to hell in a handbasket. But we're not talking about why it matters to us, where we live, and what we can do to contribute to solutions. So here's my challenge to you. In Dane County, we've got 42% of people who discuss it at least occasionally. That number could be a lot higher. And who would make that number higher? You. So what could you talk about? What should you talk about? What can you talk about? Let's talk about that next. All right. So the solution here is to address the two problems we have. We need to talk about why and how climate change matters to us, not in the future, but here, now, not over there, but here, not in an abstract way, but in a concrete way, and not in a way that's not relevant to us, you know, plants and animals and polar bears, but what is something that's relevant to us here and now that we care about. So let me give you some examples. And I'm going to start with how scientists talk about things. And then I'm going to show you how we all need to talk about things to people. Okay, so scientists talk about temperature increasing, and we share figures like this. And I'm not criticizing anyone, these are my own figures. These are the figures I created for the National Climate Assessment. And they show that our choices that will determine our carbon emissions, and our carbon emissions on the left hand side will determine how much temperature changes in the future. This is a very important message. But these colored lines of global average temperature are very abstract, very. What matters to us is what happens in the places where we live. And I love this headline from just a couple of weeks ago. Call it a Wisconsin heat wave. Temperatures in the 40 degrees by next week in February. We know that because it's getting warmer, we are seeing warmer winters in Wisconsin. We are seeing shorter ice cover in Wisconsin. We are seeing shorter snow season in Wisconsin. We are seeing increase in summer heat waves in Wisconsin. And like I said, I'm from Southern Ontario myself, and I grew up in a home that did not have air conditioning. You did not need air conditioning. And of course, now everybody is getting air conditioning because you have to have it in the summer now. So the way we can talk about how temperature is increasing is we can talk about what is happening here and what is happening now. And there's plenty of examples to talk about in Wisconsin. What else is happening? Well, from the National Climate Assessment, we know that heavy precipitation is increasing. And this makes sense in a warmer world. Why? Because warmer air holds more water vapor. And so when a storm comes along now, there's a lot more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us today than there was 50 or 100 years ago. So as a result, we've seen very significant increases in heavy precipitation. The 1% wettest days have increased by 42% across the Midwest. Now, these figures are starting to kind of get in, you can see a nice area around the Midwest, so they're starting to get a little regionally specific. But why does this matter to us? Why it matters is because we are seeing heavy precipitation, flood risk, increased insurance costs. I'm not sure about the stats for Wisconsin, but I know in Minnesota, in some places, people's insurance increased 300% because of the increased flood risk. I know that in Chicago, Cook County and the city of Chicago got sued by farmers insurance for failing to adequately prepare for the impacts of climate change on flood risk. And as part of a result, they actually dug 2 new reservoirs to hold floodwaters. So we are seeing cities having to dig new reservoirs. We are seeing insurance rates increase. We are seeing lawsuits. We are seeing national disasters being declared. I know it's hard to think back all the way to the Midwest floods, but those happened too, just a little bit before COVID. We have seen major increases in things that affect us where we live, and this is what we can talk about in a personal way. If you live out west, I started with the Midwest, but we're moving around the country now. If you live out west, of course, these were the apocalyptic skies they saw just a few months ago. How is climate change affecting wildfires? Well, most wildfires are the result of accidental human ignition. Only 7% of the big wildfires in California were deliberate arson. Most were just accidents. Like what? Like people dropping a load of burning trash into the dry brush. Yeah, really. Or electrical power lines sparking. Yes. Or people leaving an appliance plugged in their shed that shorted out and burnt down the shed and started a fire. Or gender reveal party fireworks. All of those are real things that have really started big fires the last few years. So where does climate change come in? Well, imagine that you accidentally drop a match on a pile of green wood. What happens? Not much. Imagine if you accidentally drop a match on a pile of bone dry kindling. What happens? A conflagration. So what we see, and this is another figure from the National Climate Assessment, is we see that without climate change, there would have been about 11 million acres burned by wildfire across the whole Western US naturally and normally. But with climate change, we've seen that figure doubled. There's been more than twice the area burned by wildfire, and this figure only goes up to 2015. This past year, CAL FIRE put out this stunning, shocking, astonishing figure. And again, this is not a national climate assessment type figure. This is something for the public, and it really hits you in the eye. This is the area burned by the top biggest wildfires since they started keeping records in the 1930s. The gray are wildfires that happened before the year 2000, so 1930s to 2000. The blue is from 2000 to 2019, and the red is 2020 alone. Talk about climate change loading the weather dice against us. And of course, a year ago, I know, again, it's hard to think back a year, but a year ago, what were the headlines full of? The headlines were full of the bushfires in Australia. British Columbia, Alaska, all of these places that are already prone to wildfires, they're seeing them increase as climate changes. Then we scientists talk about sea level rise, and we give you another set of colored curves of sea level rise. And you look over to the left, you say 6 feet, my goodness, that's a lot, but what does that actually mean? When we talk about sea level rise, if we actually talk about how the rate of sunny day flooding has doubled or tripled even in some coastal towns, and we can name those coastal towns today. We talk about how Miami is raising the level of its streets by 2 feet, and there's a picture of what that looks like. We can talk about how property value in the Carolinas or in Florida, according to Zillow, not according to the National Climate Assessment, according to Zillow, property values are decreasing because of rising seas. This brings it home to people who live along the coast. And then one of the most poorly understood, I should say, one of the most poorly understood aspects of climate is the fact that this extra blanket of heat trapping gases we're wrapping around the planet that's trapping all this extra heat, 93% of that is going into the oceans, 93%. So when we use thermometers to measure air temperature and talk about global warming, we are literally measuring less than 7% of the global warming. And over 90% of it's going into the ocean. Why do we care about ocean warming? Well, one reason is because it's powering stronger hurricanes. Hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean water. And we're not seeing more frequent hurricanes, but what we are seeing is they're intensifying faster, they're getting bigger, they're getting stronger, they have more rainfall associated with them, they're getting slower. And scientists are even being able to start putting numbers on this. So for example, with Hurricane Harvey, which hit Houston in Texas 3 years ago, it's estimated that almost, not quite, but almost 40% of the rain that fell during that whole storm, which in some places, upwards of 50 inches, wouldn't have happened if that same storm had happened 100 years ago. And because damages are not linear, that extra 20 inches on top of the 30 inches causes more damage. It's estimated that the financial costs were significantly higher too. Wherever we live, we are already subject to naturally occurring weather and climate disasters, wherever we live. But what's happening as climate changes is it's increasing the severity of many of these disasters, and in some cases, the frequency as well. Last year, this news just came out in January. Last year, the United States broke the record for the most number of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters to occur in a single year. 22 events, shattering the previous annual record of 16 events that occurred in 2011 and 2017. The way I think about it is this: wherever you live, you have a set of dice, wherever you live. And you always have a chance of rolling a double six. What's a double six? A double six is a heat wave or a heavy rainstorm, a flood, or an extreme event. But as climate changes decade by decade, it's as if it's sneaking in and taking one and then another of those numbers and turning them into sixes, and then even turning one to a 7. And then all of a sudden people are saying, well, we just had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years. How could that happen? And that actually happened in Houston just a few years ago. And the answer is it happens because climate change is loading the dice against us. Wherever we live, whether we live in Wisconsin, and we can talk about the heat and the ice loss and the rising water temperatures and the heavy precipitation. If we live out west, we can talk about wildfires burning greater area and longer and stronger droughts. If we live along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic, we can talk about rising seas and stronger hurricanes. Wherever we live, we can talk about things that have nothing to do with polar bears, ice sheets, or the future, and everything to do with here and now and things that matter to us. As the military says, climate change is a threat multiplier. It takes issues we already have and it makes them worse. We care about a changing climate because it takes the risks we already face today and it exacerbates them. And so why do we care? Here's where we start to connect the dots. Why do we care? We care about it because it affects everything that we already care about before. If you care about water, you already care about climate change, because climate change is increasing heavy downpours, which increases contamination and runoff, which increases pollution of our water bodies. And Also, in between, we often are seeing longer, stronger droughts, which also puts pressure on water supplies. So if you care about water, you care about climate change. If you care about food, you care about climate change, because climate change is affecting our agriculture. As winters warm, we're seeing pests and insects and diseases move further north. We're seeing more extreme temperatures that can damage productivity. We're seeing more variability in our rainfall that can affect farmers getting into their fields to plant in the spring or to harvest. If you care about the safety of your home, if you care about the economy, if you care about our health, whoever we are, we already have the values to care about climate change. And if we don't think it matters to us, and again, about 60% of the country doesn't, if we don't think it matters to us, listen very carefully, it isn't that we lack the right values. It isn't that we need to learn the right values. It isn't that someone has to teach us the right values. It's that we simply have not connected the dots between the values we already have and how if we have those values, then we already have everything we need to care about climate change. So we're not trying to instill new values into people or tell people that their values are inadequate or insufficient or judge them for those. We're just trying to figure out what makes them tick, what they already care about, and then connect the dots to show them that who they already are is the perfect person to care. And in fact, caring about climate change is a more genuine expression of who they are. If they are a parent, or if they are a farmer, or if they live in Wisconsin, or if they ice fish, or if they snowmobile, whoever they are, climate change is already affecting them here and now in ways that matter to them. If you're not a snowmobiler, it might not matter to you, but if you are, it matters to you as a snowmobiler. You see what I mean? So it isn't about changing who they are, it's about finding out who they are and then connecting the dots. Rather than the polar bear being there on the metaphorical iceberg, so to speak, we humans are actually the ones on that iceberg. After the polar bear, we're next. We all have every reason we need to care. And if we don't think we care, we just haven't connected the dots. This is a factor known as psychological distance. The idea that we see something as being a future issue, not here, not now, distant in space, not where we live, abstract, global temperature, rather than hotter summers and warmer winters and more pests and shifting seasons in Wisconsin. And we see it as irrelevant to our primary concerns. It's something that tree huggers care about, but not me, because I'm a hard-nosed farmer or whatever I am. The reality is that it matters to all of us. And here's the really interesting thing. Remember how I talked about how climate change is so politically polarized? Remember those figures I showed you with the gray bars and how climate change is the widest gray bar even today? Well, this is some research that Chris Chu, who's one of my colleagues here at Texas Tech, did. He was looking at psychological distance. And he found, obviously, that when we talk about how climate change is affecting us here and now, as opposed to in the future or far away, that it decreases psychological distance. Obviously, right? But what he also found is really interesting. He found that the closer we bring climate impacts to home, it also decreases our political polarization too. It's like a secret weapon. So when we talk about what's happening in Wisconsin and how it's affecting us where we live in Wisconsin, how it's affecting our water, our agriculture, our economy, our health, the things we enjoy doing outside, our kids, when we talk about how it's affecting us here and now, that actually decreases our political polarization too, because we're focusing on values that we share rather than values that drive us apart. Isn't that amazing? So what types of things can we share? I just want to close the last few minutes here with just some concrete examples, because I know it's hard to think of those examples. So let me close with some examples and get ready, because we're going to be taking your questions in about 5 minutes. So go to EventMobi, put your questions in there, upvote the ones you most want me to answer. But I want to close by giving you some examples. What am I talking about here? How do we start communicating with people? Well, first of all, we begin with something we share rather than something that divides us. Now, if you're talking to somebody who votes the same way as you do, then how you both vote could be something you share. But if you're not sure, avoid that like the plague, and instead go with something like the place where you both live, or the fact that you are both parents, or the fact that you may have a shared faith. You may belong to the same club or enjoy the same type of outdoor activities. You may both have military experience or be a small business owner or an engineer. Start with something that we agree on, and then connect the dots to why climate change affects something we both care about, And do not neglect to talk about positive solutions that we can engage in. Like what? Well, I've already talked about all kinds of ways that climate change is affecting Wisconsin, but here's just sort of an overview. Ice fishing, water quality, invasive species, maple syrup, heaven forbid. Again, being from Ontario, I understand the seriousness of this. I have 4 different grades of maple syrup in my pantry at all times, including cooking grade. So these things are important. They actually do matter to us. And if you can bond with somebody over maple syrup or knitting or cooking or skiing or ice fishing, there you go. You've already bonded and you've connected the dots because you can speak from the heart about how climate change is affecting something that matters to you both. But then we want to talk about solutions. And here's where it gets really fun. And finding really cool, encouraging, positive solutions to talk about is your homework. I'm going to give you a few examples though, because I love collecting them myself. I like to talk about how big businesses are taking action. Because when you talk about how Microsoft or Google or Apple or Walmart or Cargill is acting, that can make a difference. I like to talk about what's happening in Texas. We've got 23% of our energy from wind energy already in Texas. We've got the biggest army base in the US that's 43% powered by wind and solar energy. We've got the city of Houston, the home of the oil and gas industry in North America. It's meeting its Paris Agreement targets. It's got a climate plan. Talking about specific things that are happening in Wisconsin or in our area of business or in our area of faith is so important to show that there's people on board and there's real solutions that people are engaging in. So businesses, the place where we live, the community of faith that we're part of, talking about what other universities are doing. I love surprising stories, like how the Coal Museum put solar on its roof, or how United Airlines has been flying on biofuel out of the LA airport for 4 years now. That's pretty amazing, and nobody really knows that. All around the world, I like talking about how clean energy is revolutionizing the lives of people who don't have access to energy. And in Bill Gates' new book, he talks about how this was a big motivation for him to invest in clean energy because he realized that there's a strong correlation between economic growth and electricity. People's well-being depends primarily on electricity. And guess what? Last year during COVID, 90%, that's right, 90% of new energy installed around the world during COVID was clean energy. That is just amazing. That's a great story to tell. And I love telling stories about what's happening in different countries and how this is revolutionizing people's lives. If you want more stories, go to Project Drawdown. You can find it online at drawdown.org. Project Drawdown has 100 solutions, which include, photovoltaics, and they include carpooling. But did you know that if the US, through efficiency alone, implemented all of the efficiency measures that we have today with current technology, the US could cut its carbon emissions 50% and save money? I mean, that's just an amazing thing. Who doesn't want to save money? And then we can talk about nature-based solutions like coastal wetland protection and conservation agriculture. On June 1st, I'll be stepping in as chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy, and I'm really excited about how invested they are in nature-based solutions that support conservation, they support good stewardship, they support biodiversity, and they also help climate change too. The solutions we can talk about are endless. But the very first step to tackling any of this begins with you. It turns out that you, friends and family, people we know, are the best messenger, not scientists. We're number 2. Scientists are number 2. You are the best person to talk about climate change. But remember, not by sharing more scary data with people, because that paralyzes people. It causes them to reject it even more, and inaction results, remember? So where do we break the cycle? How do we break the cycle of just scaring people and continuing to polarize the issue? We break the cycle by sharing the right type of information, why climate change matters, and what we can do to fix it. And here's what that looks like. Climate changes and we're worried. So far, this is exactly the same, right? Here's where we break the cycle. Watch very carefully. We share how it affects us and positive solutions that people are already implementing today to help fix the problem. We create a true positive feedback loop, says social science researcher Matthew Goldberg from Yale, where people feel empowered and action results. And to go back to the neuroscience, this is what Tali Sharot says. She says, our brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So we need to reframe our message so the information we provide induces what? Hope, not threat. Where does hope come from? It comes from the idea of what social scientists call efficacy. Efficacy is feeling like we can make a difference. When we talk about climate change, it changes who we see ourselves as. The more we talk about something, the more invested we are in it. It changes what scientists call social norms, which is what people around us think. And as our social norms change, so too does our sense of, can we make a difference? Well, if I heard a story about somebody making a difference, I feel like, well, maybe I could make a difference too. Look at the children's climate strikes. How did they start? With one girl using her voice. And she inspired thousands of other teens and children around the world to use their voices too, because they realized that their voice could make a difference. And that in turn determines whether we're able and willing to act if we think we can make a difference or not. How does this all begin? It all begins with talking about it, talking about why it matters to us here and now in ways that affect us in Wisconsin today, and the positive ways that we can work together to fix it. That's how we can make a difference. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to taking your questions. And if you want more, this was not my TED Talk. My TED Talk is specifically, how do we talk about climate change? So this was like the preamble to my TED Talk to explain why I picked this title for my TED Talk. But if you want more, go ahead and watch my TED Talk. And remember, you are the most important person to act, and the most important thing you can do is talk to people about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katharine. I did put in the link for you, the chat in the Zoom meeting that has the correct Q&A panel. There is one question that sort of has risen to the top. It's kind of a complicated one, but it has to do with, at a big societal level, kind of at the macro level. Seems like there's this trade-off between focusing on sort of small things that add up but are relatively inexpensive, like thinking about electrification of vehicles and solar, versus maybe this macro solution of using things like a carbon tax to bend the incentive structure to get everybody to use less carbon. Where do you fall on this? Where should we be paying our attention? How big of a difference is it looking at sort of these minimal limited cost things versus big macro things?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's an either or. Clearly, we need solutions at every level. And here's a really interesting statistic that I didn't even know until this past year. Did you know that there's 500,000 elected officials in the US? So 500,000 elected officials, 0.1% of them are federal. So that means that 99.9% of officials are pretty much available. I mean, not necessarily can't say, hey, let's have coffee this morning, but they're much more accessible to talk about solutions at the level of a town, a county, a community, a state, a school board. All kinds of solutions at every level are what we need. But here's the thing. We are not operating with a level playing field. According to the International Monetary Fund, carbon emissions, fossil fuel use is currently subsidized to the tune of over $600 billion a year, which exceeds the Pentagon's budget in the United States alone. It is not a level playing field. So while we need to increase the efficiency of our energy use, while we need to transition to clean energy, if we're on a deeply slanted playing field that favors fossil fuels, it's going to be a lot harder to do that than if we're just at a level playing field where all energy costs are equal. So that's why we need policy. We need policies because they speed up and they accelerate the transition that is already happening. It's just happening too slowly. The way I think about it is, it's this giant boulder and it's already at the top of the hill. And it's already starting to roll down the hill, and it's got millions of hands on it, but it has to roll down the hill faster. So we need more hands and we need a bit of a steeper hill. And that happens through policy change. So the answer to that first question, I think, is yes. We need both. And that's why I'm such a big fan of organizations like, for example, Citizens Climate Lobby, which are ruthlessly bipartisan. and they work across the political spectrum. They actually have bipartisan climate solution caucus in Congress and in the Senate. And they talk about how carbon pricing actually has the support of Republicans, of big corporations like Ford and AT&T and even ExxonMobil. And my own home country of Canada has a price on carbon that was originally proposed by a conservative prime minister, which is very interesting. So the answer is we need everything, but what does it come back to? It comes back to using our voice. For what? To advocate for policies, for new technology, to not just get an electric car, but to tell people we have an electric car. Did you know that solar panels, for example, are contagious, literally, in a good way, not a bad way? It turns out that the #1 predictor of whether somebody will have solar panels on their home is whether somebody else within 1 kilometer of their house has them. That's the #1 predictor. So that's why talking about things is so important. And I want to just share a really good comment. Wisconsin climate video stories can be found at climatewisconsin.org. I have used those videos as examples myself, and I would encourage you to check those out because they give you lots of things to talk about. climatewisconsin.org.
Great. So one popular question here is someone saying that they love the idea of talking more, but how do you combat the fear that even your efforts to humanize climate change are going to just be dismissed by the person you're talking to, that they're going to be resistance? How do you steel yourself for that conversation? Do you have any tips or tricks?
Oh, I definitely do. And I would say, first of all, do watch my TED Talk. But I want to point out something very important that I did not mention in my talk here today, but it's really, really key. Yale has something called the 6 Americas of global warming. And I'm going to show you. I'm going to share my screen again with you right here. Let's see. There we go. Can you see that right there? Okay. We often dream or even fantasize about having a productive, constructive conversation with Uncle Joe or with that neighbor or with that old college roommate or the person who is dismissive. The person who will not stop sharing conspiracy theories on Facebook, who always talks about how electric cars are worse for the environment than regular cars, or how Texas didn't have any power because all the wind turbines froze. The person who brings up the myths that it's a natural cycle all the time. We fantasize about a positive conversation with that person. And I'm sorry to tell you that that is not going to happen. It is almost impossible. I have had thousands of conversations, and it is almost impossible to have a positive conversation with a dismissive person because they literally can't listen. They literally cannot listen to what you say. Literally, like the words just cannot, because their identity is based on rejecting the climate change. But here's the really interesting thing. 93% of us are not dismissive. 93%. And so for 93% of us, if we begin the conversation with something we agree on and share, if we connect the dots to how we're being affected, and we talk about positive, constructive solutions that they could get on board with, and we don't have to even say the words climate change. It is not necessary to say the words climate change. If we can talk about, hey, we both ice fish, man, the season's been getting shorter. I'm really worried about that. It really is getting warmer. Hey, did you know that Iowa has this much wind energy and we're a little bit behind in Wisconsin? We're missing out on these many jobs and their rates are a lot cheaper, and couldn't we do better? Those types of conversations will and often do go well, but they have to begin with something we agree on rather than something we disagree on. And we have to make sure the person's not dismissive. How do you tell if they're dismissive? Because they just will not listen to a single thing you say, and they can't leave it alone like a sore tooth.
Yeah, and I do want to point out on the agenda later today, we actually have a session that's an interactive session around climate conversations. So we're using the resources that a group out of the UK has put together. We have a facilitator in there. We're going to use this platform and allow people to at least test this out and try some of their first climate conversations. So we're really excited to build off of the momentum that you've presented today. I hate to cut it short, but I know we have another session that actually starts straight away. I want to give a warm, again, thank you from the people of Wisconsin to Katharine Hayhoe for joining us. I know you've got a busy horizon coming at you, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us. We will try to address some of the questions that were left out there. We're going to have an archive of the webpage, and we're also going to be trying to reach out to people. So we don't want to leave too many people hanging, but I do have to go to the next session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. The session you're going to have with the UK Group Climate Outreach is going to be stellar. Great. Do not miss it. And for more information, please check out our global weirding videos online, because a lot of the questions people asked are answered already by the global weirding episodes. So you can find those online at globalweirdingseries.com.
All right. Thank you, Katharine. And we'll see you all at the next sessions.